To our audience, welcome back to our corporate education webinar series. We are fresh off our first series ever held in the spring that concerned itself with COVID-19. So hopefully some of you are returning after listening to us discuss that matter. But I wanted to run something a little bit different for our summer webinar series and get into some, very interesting and timely tax issues. So that's what we're going to do this summer. And broadly for our summer webinar series, we're going to be talking about today state and local tax, SALT. But we'll also be talking about international tax. We'll be talking about tax analytics. We'll be talking about tax risk management. We'll be talking tax from A to Z throughout the summer with our presentations. And of course, Tram and I were talking about this beforehand. This isn't about filling out tax. This is about being strategic. So, yes, this is about being strategic. This is about making better business decisions if we know something about tax. Well, just a reminder that Mike and Josh, who you hear, who I refer to as the engineers, are really high-powered executives from UTA Fort Worth. So find everything about UTA Fort Worth on the UTA Fort Worth website and see all their terrific programs. The corporate education program that I'm the director of is located physically there, and that's why I interact with Mike and Josh so often. And the goal and the purpose of corporate education is to bring state-of-the-art corporate education, executive education to our community, our Fort Worth Arlington community, as well as bring the best research from our College of Business at UT Arlington and put it in a way that the layperson, the smart executive can understand. And also we want to help out our community in any way we can in these difficult times. So that's what we're about at Corporate Ed, and we run the webinar series. Coming up in the fall will be accounting and financial reporting, and coming up next spring will be corporate governance. So stay tuned for all of that. Well, with that behind us, let us turn our attention to our esteemed guests. Ms. Tram Lee, I'll refer to as Tram. We want to welcome you. We are so thrilled to have you here. You are a fellow Maverick and a graduate, and I couldn't think of anyone better to kick off today's summer webinar in tax than you. So thank you for being here.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure to be here and to talk about something I really am passionate about and really geek out on.
Well, super. I did want to mention that you have lots of letters after your name. We see CPA, JD, LLM, and obviously your, is it both undergrad and master's or one or the other from UTA?
So my undergrad in accounting is from UTA.
Right. Okay, great.
Yes.
And then your JD?
My JD and also LLM, I did both programs jointly at the University of Denver in Colorado.
Fantastic. And I think that's where you're located now with the family and consulting and all that, but or are you in Arlington? I forget.
So yeah, so the firm I work for is based in Colorado still, and I have relocated from Colorado to Texas, and I live actually Southwest Fort Worth. So I am
fantastic.
Yeah.
And I want to mention that pardon me, I'm sorry.
I'm the Texas office for my firm.
Okay, yeah, okay, of course. And we need to mention that after people hear you today, they'll want to take your class. And when do you appear next at UT Arlington as a teacher?
So I'm lined up for this fall for state and local tax. I think it's on the schedule, but I'm not sure in terms of timing when classes start, but I should be there. Hopefully okay. Everyone signs up because it's a super interesting class. I'm not going to want to miss.
Especially after they hear your remarks today. In addition, Mike, our engineer, will make it clear, and it's also in the slide deck, but He will make it clear how to get the slide deck. You're happy to receive emails from people, and I think your email contact address and that sort of thing is on the last slide of this deck, as I recall. So
Yes.
We'll get you the deck and the contact information, and look for her in the classroom as well. So, Tram, Wayfair is huge. And, you know, my expertise these days is in the international arena. And I wanted to mention to the audience that you graciously have said that I could comment a little bit about the relationship between Wayfair and what's going on in, you know, the international arena. But if we could get, you know, warmed up a little bit, you know, what is this Wayfair thing? Give us a context and maybe give us some understanding, you know, why it's important. And then, I'm sorry, you'll have a deck that you'll go through as well, but kind of warm us up with the context.
Yeah, no, sure. And, you know, I'm not quite sure of everyone who would attend today. You know, I thought about, like, I usually love having some background in terms of, like, if I'm going to hear something or learn about something, I'd like a little background. So I usually like to, like, share history, right? A little short history lesson with, you know, the people I speak with and attendees. So, you know, I'm going to just start off with, like, a short history of state and local tax, because it's actually super interesting. I mean, it's, you know, it goes way back in time where, you know, states have always had the power to impose tax ever since the Constitution was adopted. And I'm not sure if anyone knows. I mean, I kind of had to look that up because I was like, when was the Constitution? I know it's really old. When was it adopted? A long, long time ago, in 1789. So that's when it was officially adopted. So, you know, the states are given authority. They're given the power to tax way back then. So, I mean, kind of in that framework, you know, I see, and I think we all are, you know, impacted by these taxes, right, that are imposed by the state and local governments, ranging from, like, your consumption taxes, your income taxes, and your property taxes. So those are, like, your three big buckets that, you know, that you want to just understand. Like, the states have the power to generate revenue. They're going to look to those sources to generate the money that they need to provide you services and, you know, the infrastructure that we all enjoy. And so I guess, you know, going back to that history lesson, right, like, way back then, like, most state and local governments really heavily relied upon, like, the property taxes. So they did that for, like, you know, very long time until, like, the 19th or the 20th century, where they're like, oh dear, we need to find new sources of revenue. As you all may know, like, you know, in the early 1900s, we had the Great Depression. And so states had to come up with different ways to generate that revenue so they could support, you know, the services they were providing, the infrastructure, like I said, the roads, and all the things that we get to enjoy as, you know, the residents of these wonderful states. And so, you know, in that kind of 20th century turn, right, the state started imposing income taxes, which, you know, the state of Wisconsin, they actually imposed an income type of tax back in, like, 1911. So not old, but, you know, a little over 100 years now. And then states also imposed, like, the motor vehicle, gasoline, and then also liquor and tobacco type taxes, you know, shortly thereafter. And then when the Great Depression hit, you know, they are like, okay, they came up with this sales tax concept. And, you know, sales tax is actually going to be kind of our star today when we discuss Wayfair, because, I mean, like, sales and use tax, and I'll get into kind of the terminology a little bit later, but I mean, that is, like, it accounts for, like, 30% of a state's revenue. Like, if they don't collect that, you know, sales tax piece of, you know, that revenue, it's like a big hit on a lot of, you know, the state and local government. So that's kind of like my little, I guess, background history as to, you know, why we're even having this discussion today. So in terms of Wayfair, right, like, that is a completely, I mean, that case has really turned our sales tax landscape around. Like it had overturned law that had been in place for 20 something years. So the world I know, I mean, I'm not going to date myself too much, but like the world I know, I mean, sales tax and this jurisdictional nexus issue that we'll talk about really had been, longstanding as a kind of a physical presence. You had to have, your store or your people there in a state before a state could impose a tax on you. So with Wayfair, I mean, that has just turned around how businesses, are required to comply and are required to understand, these different and complex tax laws that are imposed on them. And so I guess like just the education of this is so important because, like especially for, my clients, they're generally the small to medium-sized businesses that, do really well. The owners have worked really hard. They're really good at what they do. But, tax isn't like on the forefront of their minds. So like having that knowledge is super important as they try to navigate around these new laws and, the imposition of all these taxes that they have to deal with. So that is my little background. So I think if you could forward the slide, Mike. Kind of brushed over, the agenda items, but I mean, Wayfair here. That is why, we are here today mainly. I mean, I'm sure there are many topics that we could talk about in the state and local tax area, but Wayfair has, I mean, like I said, it's a really big deal. It's overturned law that had been in, around for like 20 something years, and the economy that we knew, right, like before the internet exploded, was you go to the store and you buy something, and if it was something that a state taxed, you would pay it, and that store or retailer would collect it and remit it to the state. So the big deal here is that with the South Dakota v. Wayfair case, the Supreme Court, the big court, the court that says, hey, we all have to follow this rule, right? They basically said, stores and businesses, you no longer can hide behind this, physically present in a state before a state can make you pay tax or, impose a responsibility for you to collect the sales or use tax on, purchases from customers, either from their home or, at a storefront. And so this new ruling says, hey, the physical presence test probably wasn't the correct test, isn't the correct test now, especially given our economy, right? Like we're now high tech, we are e-commerce, we're a global economy. So these rules around how we do business, how we transact with each other across state lines, across the borders, are all very different from, 1900, the 1900s when sales tax was born. And so now this Wayfair case established this term, this legal economic nexus, which I'll refer to as like Wayfair nexus. So basically, this says like if you are selling a certain amount of if you have a certain amount of sales or a certain amount of transactions, meaning like you're invoicing customers, if you exceed a certain threshold, you're then going to be required to collect and remit taxes to that state. And so, the South Dakota v. Wayfair was one state, right? South Dakota had enacted law that said, hey, we're going to require people or businesses to, start registering and collecting tax if they have this economic presence in our state, even though they never step foot in, they don't drive on our roads, they aren't afforded the protection of our police and medical services, but we're still going to make them collect and remit the tax because they are still benefiting from our people, our economy. So, you fast forward, that was 2 years ago, right? Like almost 2 years ago here. And now we have 45 out of the, or 43 out of the 45 states, plus the District of Columbia, who all have enacted or adopted some sort of Wayfair economic nexus standard rule. The rules are quite complicated and they vary, and how they are enforced, how they're implemented are all very different. But the bottom line here is that, just being aware that almost every single state in our country hasn't enacted or adopted this new rule, this new standard for businesses to have a new tax responsibility is huge.
I wanted to ask a quick question. Is that all right?
Sure.
Ask you a quick
Absolutely.
question to get the dialogue going. Ironically, not only did, and you're going to talk about it, did the Eventbrite notice arrive, but right before the call, a package arrived at my front door. I went out and I picked it up, and it's a Wayfair package to my wife, and I got to find out what she's spending the money on. Joke. So are you saying that now in the price that my wife paid for that package, the sales tax, maybe a Texas sales tax has been added in there, and that's part of the price paid, and then Wayfair is the remitter to the state of Texas? Is that how it works?
Absolutely. That's how it works now. Not Wayfair case. It was Wayfair, Overstock, and another big vendor, Newegg, like all these big billion-dollar companies, their I guess business strategy, their operations. The way they did business, they didn't have to be in Texas, or they didn't have to be in a certain state to get customers or generate revenue. So they were like getting all this money and didn't have any kind of responsibility and weren't collecting the tax on those sales, right? So the states were losing out on that money, because obviously if the business doesn't collect it and you're buying something like a good or something tangible, which is, what sales tax is primarily based on, right? Like you're buying a good and you tax it. The consumer is actually supposed to pay it. There's a complementary use tax is what it's called. And so pre-Wayfair or, this discussion, if your wife had bought that package, right, from Wayfair, she got the package, and Wayfair was decided the other way, maybe. So you as a consumer would have been responsible, or are responsible, for remitting the tax on that good that the state of Texas would be entitled to.
Right. So, and I suppose that there's, we can think of Wayfair as a withholding agent, maybe, because many on the call are familiar with withholding. Maybe that's not the way you classify it. And I'm sure you're going to tell us about all the paperwork, right? That now they have to, the Wayfairs of the world have to engage in to be compliant. Would that be correct?
Yes, absolutely. So if you are primarily a retailer, right? If you're a wholesaler, even the paperwork you got to deal with, because you've got to make sure you've got the right paperwork and documentation to prove that you weren't responsible for, collecting a tax or remitting the tax. So all that paperwork definitely is layered in with all the things that you're required to understand and know as you operate. So,
I was curious, and if we're going to see it in the upcoming slides, are there severe penalties for lack of compliance?
Yes, the penalties, are all over the board in terms of the percentage and what they penalize you for. But the standard things are the failure to file, and then the failure to remit. And so on average, it's 25% per penalty. So it can quickly add up if you're not compliant.
Very good. So our listeners if they haven't already, they need to go back online and talk to the office and see about their Nexus footprint potentially.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Understanding Wayfair, right? Understanding where you're doing business and your Nexus footprint is super important in any kind of business, even service businesses, because I think, you and I talked earlier about the landscape of our economy has changed tremendously, and even given COVID, states are going to really need the revenue. They are going to look for it in some way, some shape or another. They will, I know there are states trying to expand what they tax, meaning it could go into services, like services like that, professionals like CPAs provide. And so that is actually very scary in terms of how that will actually play out. There are states like South Dakota that tax everything. They tax professional services, they tax goods, they tax pretty much everything. But that makes it even more complicated where, if a business is doing, they have operations in multiple states. I mean, that gets even stickier because, you got to figure out, well, where does the tax go? Now that, you have to pay the tax. So it gets very interesting. So yeah, let's, I guess the last point here in this slide is that, even though we have Wayfair now, it overturned an old Supreme Court case. It was called Quill back in 1992. That was a physical presence case. It's not gone away, right? So even if you're physically there, a state can still require you to do all the things that, we've talked about here. But I just want to emphasize that, now that you still have to keep track of what you're selling and where you're selling it, but you still have to know where you are and where you're doing it as well. So those two things still have to be on your radar, knowing where you are and then how much business you have in all these states. Okay, so I will be ready to forward on. I think the next slide here is just a snapshot of what this looks like. I mean, I have never seen movement so quick in, the masses like this, where, we had that South Dakota case, and a year or 2 years later, all the other states have followed suit and have passed laws that follow suit. And so I think out of all the states that actually impose a state sales tax, only Missouri and Florida are left without an economic Wayfair nexus standard, but it's coming. It's just a matter of time. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, so, and then I added here our Texas Wayfair rules. So Texas was one of the states that followed suit quite quick, right after the Wayfair case was decided. And in Texas, we actually didn't make any kind of like legislative change because the comptroller basically said, well, the way we've interpreted our laws and how we've enforced nexus is that we've always had this authority. So they just basically made a rule-making change, right? Like they changed it through the rule-making process internally. So they basically said, hey, this is what we're going to do. Now that the Supreme Court says this is constitutional, this is not, going against anything that we can't do. Texas says, hey, we're not going to require physical presence anymore, and we're going to set a threshold at 500,000, and we're not going to make you count any kind of transaction or invoices, like the state of South Dakota did. And then Texas said, hey, this rule is effective January 1, but we're going to let businesses, have some time to get their ducks in a row, understand what this means for them, and we're not going to enforce it until October 1 of 2019. So they gave, businesses, and this is primarily businesses that operate outside of Texas, right? Because if you're already in the state, right, you're there physically, you should have been registered and collecting already. But, we're really focusing on the remote and out-of-state businesses. And then the last bullet here talks about a look back period. And this is the other piece of it that's really complicated in terms of understanding how do you even know if you've exceeded, right, these dollar amounts or, the invoice transaction number requirements. Every state has like a formula that they use or a certain period that they'll want you to monitor what you've done. And you're supposed to, pretty much self-audit and figure out, like, did I exceed the threshold? And if I did, what do I do next? So if you could go to the next slide here. So, once you know the rules, right, you're like, well, what do I do? I'm not quite sure. Well, states are left, the businesses are left to like fend for themselves and, go through the process to understand, okay, well, what kind of license do I need? What is it called? What kind of return do I need to file? That in itself, gets really squirrely because states, they have different forms that you have to file if you're just a remote vendor or if you're an online seller only versus, you're a in-state business. And then on top of that, we have our income tax, right? The corporate income taxes. And then also in Texas, we have our Texas franchise, which, operates more like a margin tax basically. But, Texas has decided that, this economic nexus, this Wayfair nexus concept also applies to franchise tax. And they changed their rules to reflect that as well. And this was a more recent change at the end of last year where they said, okay, so businesses who have exceeded $500,000 of Texas-based receipts, we're going to also make you file franchise tax. And so, so the burden just keeps, going higher and higher, and the complexity goes with that because now they have to figure out, okay, now I have to file, do I owe anything? So, for those of you who are familiar with the Texas franchise tax, Texas does have a very generous no tax due threshold, and it's adjusted for inflation. But for this year and next, it's 1.18 million of Texas gross receipts. So even if, say, you're required to get a sales tax license and file either monthly, quarterly, annual returns, then you have the burden of figuring out, okay, now I need to file the franchise tax too, even though I've never stepped foot there. And the return is actually not awful, but the components can be very complicated if you're a type of business that you're a manufacturer or you are entitled to a lot of different deductions. It can get very complicated. So we just continue to add the layers of complexities here. Okay, so the next few slides here are going to be, I think, addressing some of your questions earlier, Bill, about how does this work and what about the paperwork and what about penalties? What really can I expect, right?
Great, thank you.
I threw a kind of a fictitious company here just to give you an example of how this could possibly work. And it's funny because, when I was putting this together, I just had a client in mind that, they're actually a New York business and they are a relatively young business. And the owners, they're super successful. They're these two brothers who created a successful online retailing business that they sell pretty much parts and accessories of things. And they created this multi-million-dollar business out of the basement of their dorm room. In their dorm room in college. So, they started this very successful business. They are in one state. They drove up revenue. They're doing fantastic. And then Wayfair came. So when Wayfair came, right, hey, they're selling to people all over the country, and they're not stepping foot in any single state other than the state of New York. And so they're like, well, look here, we've created this awesome business, and we've managed to advertise through technology, through the internet. We didn't have to send any salespeople or anybody anywhere to generate all this revenue. And so they came to us and they're like, okay, so what do we need to do here? And we're like, oh, yes, Wayfair happened, right, in 2018. And you fast forward to 2019, 2020. If you fast forward to today, you're like, well, you're behind already, unfortunately. And, in many states, being behind can have very serious ramifications because unlike, we went through the scenario in Texas where Texas said, okay, yes, Wayfair happened. And so in Texas, really the rules should have been, economic nexus, but we'll give you a break till October of 2019. But in many of these other states here in the slide, like California, Florida, Georgia and such, excluding Florida, because I threw that in just to give you an example of a state that doesn't have the economic nexus rule, it could mean some serious money. So the question is well, now that I have the successful business, what do I need to do, right? If I've sold to all these people in all these various states, what do I do? If you could forward, Mike, please. Okay, so, we have to look at all their records, right? We have to go through all their sales information to figure out, like, did they exceed? Did they meet threshold or exceed the threshold? So if they do, what would they need to do next? So our analysis here in this case study goes through state by state. And, the facts here, our company, the very successful brothers who set up this New York company, when they opened shop back in, say 2018 or 2015, that rule of physical presence that we talked about earlier had been around for a long time. So they knew, right? Hey, you got to register in New York. You got to collect taxes from our customers in New York. And so they did. And they were fine there. But in California, they did very well, but actually they didn't do as well in terms of, they didn't meet the threshold. So actually it was kind of a relief that they had not exceeded the threshold, because now what they can do is they know the rules, right? California has a $500,000 threshold. So now they can monitor, this threshold. And, the way they monitor is, they look at their prior year sales. And once, they see that, they could, as soon as they know, like, hey, I've exceeded this threshold, then they got to start the paperwork. And then in Florida here, I said I threw this one in here because obviously Florida does not have a Wayfair rule yet, so they're safe. But I mean, at the same token, you have to, know what the rules are. You got to monitor, what the states are doing. So unless you're really keeping up with all the changes, you may or may not know, like, when Florida, enacts or adopts a Wayfair rule. So that is the other challenge. And then in Georgia here, their threshold is $250,000. And the other piece that I didn't mention in the other slide was like, well, 250, 500, 100. Well, so what do these numbers mean, right? Are we looking at all sales? Are we looking at retail sales? Meaning the way a state could define what retail is. Like, it could mean any sale other than resale sales, like if you're a wholesaler, perhaps. So maybe in some instances you want to sell to somebody who will resell your product later. So you're kind of like a wholesaler in that situation. So in Georgia, they're saying, hey, if you're a wholesaler, you don't need to count your sales. So you have to know that too. So that's another little nuance that you really do have to understand how these rules work so that you can properly count your sales. And then in Illinois, we're going to register. We exceeded $100,000. And then we go to Texas. And again, here we exceed the $500,000. And we're going to also get our company registered and collecting in Texas as well.
So we have to really be aware of retroactivity. So if Florida, gets their Wayfair law, it's not enough to know that it may start in, January 2022, but they can retroactivity, correct? And we have to be aware of that. I think that's what I heard was part of your message.
Well, so that whole term, right, that is a very, that's a buzzword, very scary, retroactivity, right? When the court decided Wayfair, they said, hey, retroactivity is not something that the South Dakota laws provided for, right? They said,
right.
Going forward, this is the law. We're not going to go after people who didn't comply prior to the law. I mean, and if that's retroactivity is what you're referring to.
Yeah, exactly. Like it just appeared on one of the states that you mentioned that the effective date was 2019, but you had to go back to some date in 2018 to pay some tax on historical activity pre, the implementation of Wayfair. That's the way I interpreted it. If I'm wrong, I don't want to mislead our audience.
Okay, so with regards to how businesses should think about like potential like past liability.
Yeah.
It really does vary from state to state. So, these effective and enforcement date rules are very important to understand how they work. So if a state says our new Wayfair law is effective as of a January 1 date, and you measure, right, like your past sales to figure out by the time January comes, if you have exceeded that threshold, if you have fall under, the standard, like if you're,
Right.
if you surpass that, then yes, you need to start collecting that January 1 date. However, if you hadn't started collecting on January 1, and so now we're in June, right?
Yeah.
And you realize, oh my goodness, like I exceeded last year and the law came into effect in January and I'm now in June. So you do have arrearage issues, right?
Okay.
From January to June.
January
So
to June. Okay.
That's typically how it works.
Gotcha.
But in terms of like, say, Florida, right? Yeah, they are. I mean, there's a lot of like bills out there that are being introduced with economic nexus and Wayfair nexus. But if they were to enact a bill that said, hey, we're going to go back to Wayfair, right? Wayfair date 2018.
Yeah, right. That's
try to enforce that, right?
Yes. Right.
They could possibly do that. However, I mean, I personally, and I think, it was addressed in the Wayfair case where it might not be constitutional to retroactively go back to people unless they could argue, well, that was always our rule.
Yeah.
And so it gets kind of dicey. But at the same token, I guess I wouldn't be completely surprised or shocked if a state would try to do something like that, because I mean, they are in desperate need of money and revenue. So, we'll kind of
just a real quick question, because very interesting. Is the obligation to pay the right amount of sale tax during the course of the fiscal year, or in some tax settings, that correct amount has to be paid monthly or quarterly? What is the time period so our listeners know that they have to be absolutely accurate, annually or some other period?
So it varies, actually, in terms of the filing frequency is, I think, your question.
Yes.
Some states, most states, right, they'll indicate, like, if your taxable sales are over a certain threshold, like say $3,000 or $5,000, then you're required to file monthly. If it's, $2,000 to $5,000, maybe quarterly, and under $2,000 annually. So all those numbers are all over the place in terms of, thresholds and the frequencies. Right. So you'll also have to know that. And sometimes they change. And sometimes, a state, like I know New York will say, well, if you don't really know because you're new to our state, you don't really exactly have an idea, you'll start on an annual basis, and then after that annual basis, then you, based on that year that you've filed, you can go forward and be a quarterly or monthly filer.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. So then here, I guess the case study goes into like all the different rules and all the different effective dates that these states have, and understanding the effective date and knowing when you've exceeded and knowing when you need to register is really not an easy task unless you're like really into the weeds and reading the regulations and reading the law, exactly how you count it, when you're required to register. Because there are states that say, we'll give you 90 days, we'll give you 60 days to register once you've exceeded. And then there are states that say, you're going to be required to register and start collecting the next day. So it is so hard. But I mean, like when we advise clients, we're like, to the extent that it makes sense, right? Like the next transaction, and you've got several 100,000 transactions going on in any given day, it's really hard to like be so precise. So, the practical approach that we always advise is that monitor it, understand the rules, and follow the rules as best as you can in terms of like, go ahead and if you're almost there, you should go ahead and be proactive and register prospectively, right? Like, I'm in June. I'm like, I know I'm going to exceed, I better like get on the website and get me a license for July
Gotcha.
1. So that's how we advise.
Good.
All right. And so this case study example, I mean, I give you more sales data, right? Because it's you have to know what you're doing and how much you're doing it and where. And then if you could go to the next slide. This slide here basically gives you the calc of where we registered based on how these different states measure and when they expect you to start collecting based on your sales, the type of your sales. Are they retail? Are they wholesale? Are they exempt, right? Do you count them? Do you not count them? But at the end of the day, whatever is subject to tax is what you would owe in terms of the sales tax. And then on top of that, right, like there's definitely interest, and interest is also another one of those where it varies on how like a state could impose it. Like some states will say, we'll impose like 10% interest at the very first, day one of, the first of the month, or, it could accrue based on daily increments. So it just kind of varies, but like on average, it's about 10%. And so where our New York company here had been doing so well, they were selling all over the country and had kind of missed the ball on Wayfair, right? They weren't sure, like, what do we need to do? And at that time, that client actually received notices from like several states. And they're like, we don't know what to do with these notices. And it's so amazing that these states know about where a company is doing business, where they're selling into, even without, being there. Because typically pre-Wayfair, like I think states were able to audit like non-compliant taxpayers or businesses by virtue of like the sharing of information. So like, if you had an employee, like, so you're a New York business and you had an employee in California, the way a state could share information, like California, you send an employee there, you have to get them, the wages, payroll, withholding, workers' comp, all those things that you would do for an employee, right? They're in the database, they're in the system. And so all the governments, all the different agencies in the state share information. And so if you've got a worker, you've got workers' comp, you've got withholding, you've got, all the different things going on in the state, but no sales tax license, they will find you. So with that, I mean, if you could just scroll back real quick, Mike. I just outlined here, like the penalties and interest really add up. I mean, like it accounts for like half of what you actually owed. And so, it's very common in my world because this is what I deal with every day, but, other practitioners who are like in the federal space or, I have friends who advise businesses on like contracts or, business planning. I mean, like they have no idea like the state tax could take out a company. Like even if you file for bankruptcy, the tax liability follows the owners. It attaches because, sales tax is a fiduciary tax. I think you mentioned earlier, like if you're concerned like with withholding, right? Like that type of a tax, it's the same kind of situation. So please beware.
So we had about 15 minutes left, and I know you're moving into the marketplace facilitator, which is really an interesting topic. So I will stay quiet so you can really tell us all about it. This is pretty cool stuff.
It is very cool stuff. And this area of law here has really come from Wayfair. So basically it's trying to fill in the gaps. These marketplace facilitator laws are filling in the gaps where Wayfair has said, okay, states, you may collect from all these remote and out-of-state companies now. Well, I mean, that's nice, but then, the way we do business, right? We have our Amazons of the world, the Walmart.coms, the third-party sellers that are actually the ones, right, interacting with customers. So this is where this law comes from, this area of law, because they're trying to make sure that the states are able to reach the third-party sellers. even though they're not the ones selling the goods, they're not the ones actually, renting out this, like Airbnb. They're not the ones renting out the home or the hotel for a customer. It's these facilitators. So now the shift here with the marketplace facilitator laws, it's shifting the burden from, the actual marketplace seller is the term, right? The actual sellers, the retailers of the world. They're shifting the burden over to these marketplaces. And in many states, marketplaces defined very broadly, and rightly so, right? It's trying to capture all the different ways that companies are doing business. So, it just takes you to like come up with an idea, right? You're going to start selling your good on Amazon. Well, you know what? You as the seller now are relieved of the liability, and now Amazon is going to be the one required to do it because, it makes sense, right? Because they have all the information about the seller. The buyer, they're actually the ones usually taking payment and processing it. So that's what this is all about. And so, with regard to your email bill on Eventbrite, that's exactly what this is about, right? Eventbrite is not the one per se, like hosting a event. They're the ones facilitating the event. So now the burden falls on them to collect.
So they collect and they remit what they need to a state, and the net goes to the seller.
Yes, exactly right.
Yeah, okay.
Correct. Yeah.
Right.
So that's how this all works. And amazingly, I think the next slide gives us, if I remember. I think I talked about this, how like they're all different, right? The states all impose all these laws, but how they define what a marketplace is very different. But generically, you're going to have any kind of business that they're facilitating through a platform, through a physical store, through any kind of means to connect a buyer and a seller. So generally and very broadly defined. And so just like the Wayfair laws, right? Like most states have passed or adopted Wayfair laws. And now we only have 8 states that actually don't have a marketplace facilitator law in place. But it's just a matter of time. And then Texas, just as an example, about the same time where we adopted the Wayfair Nexus rules, we also adopted, we actually passed through legislation, this marketplace facilitator law. And so, this here is just for reference if you want to read exactly how it's defined. I think the next slide gives the actual definitions. So as you can see here, it's like any physical or electronic medium which connects the owner, the seller to the buyer.
In corporate tax, you're familiar with the infamous W-8 Ben or W-9 Ben. Is there a corollary here that all our listeners are going to get used to that, like an Amazon has to fill out to collect as a facilitator of the tax? I think I've said this probably more often than anything else. Like, it depends, right? How it works, how it's enforced, administered just varies. And in some cases, like the requirements could be only if they're taking payment would you be required to file and remit, right? So, but then in some states it says you could be it's either very narrow or very broad. So then the very broad marketplace states will say you just have to figure it out. Right.
If that makes sense.
Sure. Okay.
And then this slide talks about some of the things we've touched upon already, like having to figure out what to collect, where to collect, and the right rates. I didn't get into like rates and sourcing, meaning, which state actually is entitled to the money. And sometimes it could be multiple states. And so, understanding those rules, like these marketplaces, in addition to these retailers and businesses, they all have to understand like what's even taxable and who does it go to. and how do we manage exemptions, right? Like, are we selling to somebody exempt? And so now marketplaces are having to manage exemption certificates and having to manage, registrations and all the other good stuff that, it's actually very, very hard to manage unless you know what you're doing. And so then the other side that you could take is that, okay, then I'll over collect. I'll always collect. So that I don't, I'll over collect. I mean, we hear businesses say, that want to take this position of, oh, I'll just always charge tax so I don't get in trouble. Well, no, that's actually a very bad idea. Because when you over collect, right, that's also not legal per se, because your customers, right, are going to, the ones that actually care and are savvy or where it is material, you could possibly be sued. And there were a lot of lawsuits, like class action lawsuits under the QTAM concept, which it was very unfortunate because I think those lawyers were like jumping on the bandwagon where if a business was over collecting sales tax, their customers could possibly be suing them for possibly the whole fraud issue. And and in many cases, businesses aren't intentionally over collecting, but if they don't know the rules, that could be some serious legal ramifications for them too.
Are there accuracy related penalties if they do that?
Well, I mean, not accuracy per se. I think that the issue would be fraud related penalties, negligent type of things.
Okay. Right.
So.
Okay, great. Also, I wanted to ask quickly, from a customs perspective, if you import a good into the UK and it's going to flow to France and not stay in the UK, some countries will not put customs duty because it's a flow through. What happens if Wayfair, if an item flows through Texas to Oklahoma? Is it taxed both places, Texas and Oklahoma?
Well, generally, so most states have a temporary. I mean, if you want to argue, I temporarily flowed it through Texas, but ultimately used it in Oklahoma. Right? There are exemptions and exceptions. So you have to understand what those are, because it's usually a temporary 60 days at most. And then if it exceeds whatever, day the state allows, it's going to be subject to tax. And then you move it again, then you have to pay tax again in Oklahoma.
So this would reinforce what you and I believe, that it's not enough to fill out forms. You really have to understand how the business operates, right? So you got to know your value chain so you can figure out, where, when, and how to apply the tax. Would you agree? Absolutely.
So facts always matter. And because sales tax is a transaction tax, you have to understand all the moving parts, right? How the transaction flows to appropriately tax it.
So this has been fantastic. We have about 5 minutes left, Tram, and you're free. There are some great resources.
Yep.
If you could give us the key takeaways for our audience, given your remarks, what are, the top 5, the top 3 takeaways? When they leave, what should they run and do? Who should they go call? What should they go do?
Well, so I think definitely the first thing is, know your own truths. That's the thing. You have to understand what you're doing, know what you're doing before you can go out and ask those questions, right? And when you hire, definitely the next step is hire the professional, obviously, but the first step is to understand your own business and know where you're doing it and make sure your information, your books and records are good, because without that information, it is hard to understand and figure out the path to go.
Right.
So I would definitely advise on understand yourself and then become knowledgeable and seek out advice. So
awesome. a major change in tax law like this, taxpayers find that their existing systems of information are not adequate to document what needs to be documented in order to pay the tax. Are you finding that among your clientele, that it's not just a matter of compliance, but they're having to like rearrange or rethink how information is available in the system?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, like I had another client here in Fort Worth, and they, they sell to municipalities, they sell us SaaS, right? Like they're like, oh, we have no idea how to handle this. And so like the first thing is to understand who they are, right? And then during that fact finding, understanding who we are, like they're like, well, we don't have very good records. And we in order to truly like do what we need to do, the whole books and records it's amazing how like businesses do so well in what they do, but yet when it comes to like the compliance side of it, it kind of bites them in the back if how they're doing business doesn't support what they're doing from a tax perspective.
Would you agree that what our listeners have to do is convince, their CEO, their CFO, or whatever, that invest in the right systems to get this information is a way for them to plan for the future and maybe reduce sales tax, right? You got to turn this this compliance directive into a planning opportunity. What is your comment on that?
Yes, no, definitely leveraging technology. Given now how spread out our economy is, right? Like how we do business, how we're not just bounded by our community here where we live, right? It's a global economy. So to the extent that we can leverage that technology, understanding that what systems we have in place, what software we're using, understanding how that software works and what information is going into that software really dictates how successful you can be in kind of owning this, right? Owning your tax obligations and feeling good about it, right? Like if you take a more proactive approach in understanding, what you're needing to do, understanding what the laws are, right? And how you best comply, like that is, that formula there is the key to success, because otherwise, you'll always kind of question, like, do we have the right systems in place? What if we got audited? How would we handle this? That always goes bad.
Right. Well, Tram, unfortunately, I mean, we could talk all afternoon. This is extremely, extremely interesting. Thank you again. I just wanted to remind our listeners that we'll be making your deck available, your contact information, and maybe on the next slide advances that.
I think it should be.
There's a checklist, and I forget. I thought.
Yep, I think there it is.
There it is. Let's stay connected. There's all the information on Tram, so people, if they have follow-up questions, they need any advice, they want to hear about your class, they can just contact you, and we encourage folks to do that. So I will say, as our time is running out, that Mike, our engineer, is here, and I think our next session is I forget. Mike will tell.
We have upcoming sessions next week with Dr. Is it Knut Olson? Knut. Excuse me.
Yeah.
He's an adjunct professor lecturing in international taxation and global tax advisor with Knut Olson Global Tax Consulting in UK and Norway. He'll be discussing tax risk management next week with us at 1 p.m. on June 24th. And there's probably about 5 extra sessions that are also out on our corporate education website. So if you go to fortworth.uta.edu/corped, I put it in the chat box so that you do have that link and you can get registered there. Again, since we're at the end of the webinar here, I do want to make the announcement again for our participants. If you did not register, I know about a handful of you have sent me emails, but if you did not register for this webinar and you're looking to get your certificate of completion for your 1 credit hour, please do send me an email with your first and last name, and that way we can get the certificate out to you. But I do want to say a special thank you, as Dr. Seeger has said, to you, Tram, for being with us today. This has been absolutely valuable information. Especially, I do not have a tax background, but I will tell you right now, it makes you realize how much is involved when you're thinking about starting your online business and everything else that's out there, which we have talked about plenty of times. So, I thank you on behalf of myself and the rest of the UTA Fort Worth team as well being here today. So.
Well, thanks for having me. This was, a topic that's near and dear to me. So I am happy to share and be here anytime.
Okay. Well, take care, Tram. We look forward to seeing you soon. And Michael, carry on doing all the good stuff, you and Josh. Thanks so much.
All right. Thanks, folks. And the link will be getting sent out to everybody, by the way. We will be putting out the recording of this to all of you through email. So, all right. Have a great day, everyone.
Okay. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.